You have exactly 10 seconds to decide whether your dignity is worth more than $1,000. The words landed inside the Manhattan rooftop restaurant like a glass set down too hard on marble. Conversations did not stop immediately, but they thinned, as if the air itself had decided to listen. At the center of it all stood William Carter, a 38-year-old billionaire CEO of Carter Holdings, a man whose presence was always quieter than his influence. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, cufflinks reflecting the warm glow of chandeliers, his expression calm in the way only people accustomed to control can afford to be. Around him, New York's elite continued their rituals of wine and negotiation, unaware that a different kind of transaction was beginning at the edge of the room. Aaliyah Johnson moved between tables with practiced precision, a black waitress in her late 20s balancing a tray of crystal glasses filled with sparkling water and imported wine. She was used to being invisible in spaces like this, where recognition was reserved for last names and balance sheets. Her life was measured in shifts, rent deadlines, and the quiet discipline of someone who had learned not to expect ease. Tonight, she had already worked 7 hours, her feet carrying the weight of polished floors and unspoken expectations. She noticed William before he noticed her, which was always how it worked in rooms like this. He did not look at staff unless he had to, and even then it was usually to correct, instruct, or dismiss. But this time, he was watching her with a kind of focus that did not belong to routine service. When she reached his table, he did not ask for water or wine. Instead, he leaned slightly forward, lowering his voice just enough to separate his words from the room's ambient noise. "I need you to do something for me," he said, as if it were a matter of scheduling rather than humanity. Aaliyah paused, tray still balanced in her hand, her posture unchanged, but her attention fully present. She had learned long ago that the most important moments in her life often began with requests that sounded simple. "I am attending a private investor gala in 2 days," William continued. "I need you to pretend to be my wife. Just for the evening. You will be compensated $1,000. The number hung between them like something too small to explain what it was supposed to buy. Around them, the restaurant continued its soft symphony of clinking glasses and muted ambition, but something in Aaliyah's perception shifted. It was not shock that came first. It was calculation, not of money, but of meaning. William's gaze remained steady, not unkind, but absolute in the way people look when they believe they are offering opportunity instead of intrusion. Aaliyah slowly set the tray down on a nearby service stand, the glassware chiming softly as it settled. For a brief moment, she said nothing. Silence, in her experience, was not emptiness, it was information. It told her what people expected of her before she spoke. "And what exactly makes you think I would agree to perform a version of myself for your convenience?" she asked finally, her voice calm, measured, without edge or softness to soften its weight. The question did not raise in volume, but it changed the temperature of the space between them. William studied her as though recalculating a known equation that had suddenly produced an unexpected variable. He was used to outcomes aligning with intent, negotiations bending toward logic, not resistance. Aaliyah did not look away. She had spent years learning how to stand still in rooms that tried to move her. And in that stillness, something subtle began to shift, though neither of them yet understood the direction it would take. William Carter did not respond immediately. He had been in hundreds of negotiations that involved numbers far larger than $1,000. Yet he found himself unusually aware of the silence between them. Around them, the rooftop restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, glasses touching gently, conversations flowing in low waves, but at their table, the air had tightened in a way that felt deliberate. He studied Aaliyah Johnson with the same precision he used when reviewing contracts that could shift entire markets. She stood still, not retreating, not advancing, simply waiting in a way that did not signal obedience or defiance, but something far more difficult to read. Finally, William leaned back slightly, as if adjusting the tone of the conversation rather than its meaning. "I am not asking you to become someone you are not," he said in a controlled voice. "It is a role, a presentation, nothing more than an evening where appearances matter." Aaliyah's expression did not change, but her attention sharpened. She had heard versions of this logic before in different forms, from customers who treated kindness as entitlement, from supervisors who disguised pressure as opportunity. But something about this moment felt structurally different. It was not casual arrogance. It was calculated necessity. William continued, his voice steady, each word measured. There will be investors present, international partners, people who evaluate decisions based on perception before substance. My personal life is under scrutiny, and my presence alone is not enough to stabilize what is at stake. He paused briefly, as if choosing whether to reveal more. A partner was expected to accompany me. That arrangement changed unexpectedly. I need stability in that narrative. Only for one evening. Aaliyah slowly folded her hands in front of her, no longer balancing anything, no longer performing the motions of service. The distinction between being spoken to and being consulted had become clear in the space of seconds. So what you are saying, she replied evenly, is that my presence is useful because it completes a picture that others expect to see. William did not correct her. That absence of denial carried more weight than agreement. Around them, a waiter passed unnoticed, refilling a nearby table's water glasses, the ordinary world continuing its choreography of invisibility and privilege. Aaliyah glanced briefly toward the skyline beyond the glass walls, the city stretching outward in layers of light and distance. In that reflection, she saw not opportunity, but structure, systems of value built on perception rather than truth. She returned her gaze to William. And if I refuse, she asked, what then becomes incomplete in your picture? The question was not emotional, yet it carried the kind of pressure that forced clarity rather than reaction. William exhaled slowly, as though acknowledging that this was no longer a simple exchange. Then I adjust, he said. But adjustment comes with consequences that are easier avoided than managed. It was not a threat in tone, but in architecture, the language of systems rather than individuals. Aaliyah understood that kind of language. It was the same language used in decisions that never named the people they affected. For the first time, she allowed a faint shift in her posture, not agreement, not refusal, but consideration. The job she held required hours measured in patience and endurance, the kind of life that did not often leave room for leverage. Yet here, at a table elevated above Manhattan's glowing streets, she was being asked to step into a version of herself that would exist only for someone else's convenience. William observed her silence carefully. He had learned that silence often contained the most accurate form of negotiation. It is only one evening, he added, his tone slightly softer now, though still controlled. And you would not be unseen in it. You would be necessary. That word lingered differently than the others. Necessary implied recognition, but also function. Aaliyah understood both. She had been necessary in kitchens, in dining rooms, in shifts that required her presence, but not her identity. The difference now was scale, not substance. She looked at him again, her voice quieter when she finally spoke. You are asking me to step into a world that already decided what I am before I speak, she said. And you are offering me money as if it changes the shape of that decision. William did not interrupt. For the first time since the conversation began, he did not try to correct the framing. The city lights beyond the glass flickered subtly as traffic moved far below, indifferent to the exchange above it. Aaliyah remained still, but something internal had clearly shifted, not toward acceptance, but toward understanding the structure of the request more fully than before. And in that understanding, the nature of what would come next had already begun to change. The rooftop lights of Manhattan seemed to stretch farther as the silence between William Carter and Aaliyah Johnson deepened, not as emptiness, but as a form of negotiation neither of them was willing to name aloud. William finally shifted his posture, placing both hands on the table with controlled precision, as if anchoring the conversation to something more structured than uncertainty. You are not being asked to deceive anyone in a harmful way, he said carefully. You are being asked to participate in a necessary perception for a single evening where perception determines outcomes that affect far more than one interaction. Aaliyah listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her presence still anchored in calm restraint. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet luxury, but their table had become an isolated point of tension within it. William continued, his voice measured, as though each word had been reviewed before being spoken. There are individuals attending this event who do not respond to financial performance alone. They respond to stability signals, relational signals, indicators that suggest continuity rather than disruption. My attendance alone is insufficient to satisfy those expectations. He paused, then added, the absence of a partner creates questions I cannot afford to have become the focus. Aaliyah tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of the logic being presented. It was not personal in his framing, it was structural. That distinction, however, did not remove the implication of her role within it. So, she said slowly, what you are really asking is not for me to pretend to be your wife. You are asking me to become part of a signal you believe other people need in order to trust you. William did not deny it. That silence again carried more truth than any confirmation could. Aaliyah glanced down briefly at her hands, then back up at him. Her voice remained even, but there was now something more deliberate in her tone. You are describing people who evaluate reality based on what they see rather than what is true, she continued. And you are building a solution that depends on me participating in that. Distortion. William exhaled softly, as though acknowledging the precision of her interpretation. It is not distortion, he replied. It is communication. Every environment has its language. In some environments, truth is not the first language that is understood. Aaliyah absorbed that without reaction, but internally something had clearly aligned into sharper focus. She had worked long enough in spaces where value was assigned before identity was understood. What William was describing was simply that systems scaled upward, polished by wealth instead of survival. A passing server approached their table quietly, refilling a glass of water without acknowledging the tension in the air, then moved away as silently as they had arrived. That brief interruption reminded Aaliyah of something simple but important. Most people in this room were trained to navigate around power, not question its structure. William leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice further. I am not asking you to abandon your boundaries, he said. I am asking you to temporarily extend your presence into a controlled environment where your role will be defined, contained, and compensated. He paused again, then added, and where you will not be alone in the room. Aaliyah looked at him more directly now, as if evaluating not the offer, but the intention behind it. You keep using the word controlled, she said quietly. But control is not neutral. It always belongs to someone. William held her gaze. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed through his expression, not discomfort, but recognition that the conversation had moved beyond convenience into something more foundational. Aaliyah continued, her tone still steady but more defined. If I step into that environment, even for one evening, I am not just being seen differently, she said. I am being positioned differently. And once something is positioned, it tends to stay that way in the eyes of people who do not look closely. William did not respond immediately. The city beyond the glass shimmered in layers of distance and motion, indifferent to the decisions being weighed above it. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Then what would you require to make it your decision, not mine? He asked. The question shifted the atmosphere again, not resolving tension, but reframing it. Aaliyah did not answer right away. Instead, she let the silence settle fully, as if allowing the weight of the question to reveal its own boundaries. In that pause, something subtle began to change between them, not agreement, not refusal, but the beginning of terms that had not yet been spoken. The question lingered in the air between them, not as pressure, but as a shift in ownership of the conversation itself. William Carter noticed it immediately. For most of his professional life, conversations ended where he intended them to end, either through agreement, dismissal, or structured compromise. But Aaliyah Johnson was not moving toward any of those familiar endpoints. She remained still, not resisting, not yielding, but occupying the space in a way that forced him to reconsider the framework of the exchange. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, deliberate, and unhurried. If I were to consider this, she said, then it would not be on the basis of what you need. It would be on the basis of what I would be stepping into and what I would be expected to represent once I am there. William listened without interruption, his attention fully engaged now in a way that had shifted from transactional focus to analytical curiosity. Aaliyah continued, her eyes steady. People in rooms like the one you are describing do not separate performance from identity very easily. Even when something is presented as temporary, it often becomes the version they remember. That means I am not just agreeing to a role. I am agreeing to how I will be perceived after I leave it. William leaned back slightly, absorbing the implication. He had anticipated negotiation, but not this level of structural awareness of perception itself. The distinction she was drawing was precise, and it introduced variables he had not fully accounted for. That is a fair observation, he replied after a brief pause. But perception is already part of every professional environment at that level. You are not entering a new system of judgment. You are stepping into one that already exists. Aaliyah did not react immediately, but her silence carried a different quality now. It was no longer exploratory, it was evaluative. She was no longer testing his reasoning alone, but the integrity of the entire proposition. Then the question becomes, she said slowly, why you believe adding me changes the stability of that system rather than revealing its dependency on appearance. William studied her more carefully now. The conversation had moved away from the simplicity of substitution and into something closer to philosophy of influence. He had built his career on controlling variables, but Aaliyah was identifying the variables behind the variables. Around them, the restaurant continued its subdued rhythm, but their table had become an isolated point of recalibration. William finally spoke with less certainty than before. Because stability in that context is not only about facts, he said. It is about continuity of expectation. People trust what feels consistent with what they believe they already understand. A disruption in that expectation can create hesitation in decisions that depend on confidence. Aaliyah nodded slightly, acknowledging the logic without accepting its conclusion. So I would be functioning as continuity, she said. A bridge between expectation and presentation. William did not correct her. The accuracy of her phrasing made correction unnecessary. For the first time, he considered that what he was asking for was not performance alone, but integration into a narrative structure that others would interpret as authenticity. Aaliyah's gaze shifted briefly toward the city beyond the glass, where streams of headlights traced invisible paths through the night. When she spoke again, her tone carried a quieter firmness. You are describing a world where meaning is constructed before truth is observed, she said. And you are asking me to step into that construction as if my presence does not alter how it was built in the first place. William exhaled slowly. The precision of her understanding was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as either resistance or compliance. It was something more fundamental, an awareness of systems rather than positions within them. Then tell me what would make it acceptable to you, he said, his voice now less directive and more open. Not in terms of money, but in terms of conditions. Aaliyah turned her attention fully back to him. The shift in his language mattered more than the request itself. Conditions implied boundaries that were acknowledged rather than assumed. She paused for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of calculation of consequence. If I were to step into this, she said finally, then I would need clarity on what remains mine. My decisions, my voice, my exit. No reinterpretation after the fact. William held her gaze and gave a subtle nod. For the first time since the conversation began, the structure of the exchange was no longer defined solely by his intent. Something had changed in its architecture, not resolved, but redrawn in real time through language, awareness, and the quiet assertion that even temporary roles still carry permanent implications once they are witnessed. The weight of silence between them had changed again, not heavier, not lighter, but more structured, as if both William Carter and Aaliyah Johnson had unknowingly agreed to operate within a newly defined space. The city outside the glass walls of the rooftop restaurant continued its steady movement, headlights tracing slow lines through the dark avenues of Manhattan, but inside, time felt more deliberate. William studied her for a moment longer before speaking, his tone now less about persuasion and more about understanding limits. What you are describing, he said carefully, is control over your own narrative within a situation where narratives are already externally defined. Aaliyah did not respond immediately. She allowed the sentence to settle fully, as if testing its weight against her own principles. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, but it carried a quiet precision. I am describing ownership of consequence, she said. If I am seen in a role that is not mine, then I need to know what parts of me remain untouched by that interpretation. William nodded slowly. For him, the concept was becoming less abstract and more operational. He had entered this conversation expecting negotiation over participation, but But what he was receiving was negotiation over identity boundaries, something far more complex than logistical arrangement. That is reasonable, he said after a brief pause. And I am not asking for reinterpretation beyond what is agreed. The purpose is contained within a single evening event, not beyond it. Aaliyah's gaze did not waver. Intent and interpretation are not always aligned, she replied. Once people observe something, they carry their version of it forward, regardless of what was originally intended. William leaned slightly forward again, resting his forearms on the table, his posture signaling a shift from authority to engagement. Then we define parameters more clearly, he said. You decide what you are willing to present. You decide how you will respond to questions. And you decide when the arrangement ends, regardless of external pressure. The inclusion of those terms changed the tone subtly. Aaliyah recognized it immediately. It was no longer a request framed as convenience. It was becoming a structured agreement, at least in language. Still, she did not accept or reject it. Instead, she examined it. And in that environment, she said, where people interpret relationships as signals of value, how will my decisions be protected from being reframed by others who were not part of this agreement? William paused. It was a question that did not have a simple operational answer. It pointed to something beyond contractual clarity, into social interpretation, something even his influence could not fully control. They will not be fully protected, he admitted, but they can be contextualized. Aaliyah acknowledged that with a subtle shift in expression, not agreement, but recognition of limitation. Around them, the restaurant's ambient sounds continued unchanged, yet their conversation had now created a distinct boundary from the rest of the room. William observed her carefully again, noticing that her silence was no longer hesitation but evaluation of systemic impact. Finally, it was not a question. Aaliyah considered the statement before responding. Visibility is not the issue, she said. Misalignment between visibility and understanding is. William processed that in silence for a moment. It was clear to him now that what he had initially framed as a simple solution to a presentation problem had evolved into a negotiation about interpretive risk. And Aaliyah was not treating that risk lightly. He exhaled slowly, then spoke with a quieter tone than before. Then let me ask you directly, he said. If all conditions you have outlined are respected, would you consider participating in the arrangement for the duration required? Aaliyah did not answer immediately. She looked past him briefly, toward the glowing skyline, where thousands of independent decisions were unfolding simultaneously, each unaware of the others. When she returned her attention to him, her voice was steady. I would consider it only if the arrangement is not framed as replacement, but as temporary collaboration with full acknowledgement of my autonomy within it, she said. William nodded once, slowly, as if recognizing that the structure of the conversation had reached a point where agreement was no longer about persuasion, but about alignment of principles. And for the first time since the conversation began, neither of them spoke immediately afterward, allowing the silence to hold not tension, but the beginning of something that had not yet been finalized, but was no longer uncertain in direction. The agreement was no longer an abstract negotiation, but something closer to a defined structure that both William Carter and Aaliyah Johnson were beginning to understand through carefully measured language rather than emotion. The rooftop restaurant had begun to quiet further as the night deepened, the city beyond the glass continuing its distant rhythm of motion and light, while inside, the conversation had settled into a more deliberate pace. William studied her in silence for a brief moment before speaking again, his tone now more precise than persuasive. Then we are no longer discussing possibility, he said. We are discussing conditions that define participation. Aaliyah did not respond immediately. She allowed the phrasing to settle, recognizing the subtle shift in ownership of the conversation. It was no longer framed as persuasion from one side to another, but as mutual definition of boundaries. When she finally spoke, her voice remained calm and steady. Conditions only matter if they are respected without reinterpretation once the context changes, she said. William nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without resistance. That is understood, he replied. There will be no reinterpretation beyond what is agreed here. Aaliyah held his gaze, her expression unchanged but attentive. And there will be no expectation of continuation beyond the defined time frame, she added. William paused briefly before answering. Correct. The single word carried a sense of closure that was not final, but functional. Around them, the restaurant staff moved with quiet efficiency, unaware that the conversation at this table had shifted from a simple transactional request into something more structurally significant for both individuals involved. William leaned back slightly, his attention now less about convincing and more about alignment. Then we move forward with clarity, he said. The event is scheduled in 2 days at a private venue in Midtown Manhattan. The duration will not exceed 3 hours. You will not be required to engage beyond what you are comfortable with. Aaliyah absorbed the information without visible reaction, but internally, she was mapping the structure of what was being proposed. It was not simply attendance. It was presence within a system of perception she did not control, surrounded by individuals whose interpretations would extend beyond the immediate moment. And after the event, she said, there will be no continued association implied or expected. William met her gaze directly. There will be no implied continuation, he confirmed. A moment of silence followed, not tense, but defined by mutual recognition of terms. It was no longer about persuasion or hesitation. It was about precision. Said, who will be present, what the expectations of interaction are, and what kind of questions may be asked. William acknowledged this immediately. You will receive a full briefing before the event, he said. Names, roles, and anticipated dynamics. Nothing will be left unaddressed. Aaliyah considered this, then added one final condition. And I will not be introduced in a way that suggests ownership or substitution of an existing role, she said. William did not hesitate. Agreed. The words settled between them with a finality that felt more structural than emotional. For the first time since the conversation began, there was no longer negotiation of intent, only confirmation of boundaries. A passing reflection of city lights moved across the glass behind William, briefly illuminating the contours of the table between them. Neither of them spoke immediately afterward. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain or evaluative. It had become the quiet space where agreement existed without need for further justification, where two individuals had not resolved difference, but had instead defined the exact shape of their temporary alignment. The final confirmation settled between them not as celebration, but as alignment, the kind of agreement that did not require repetition because every boundary had already been clearly defined in language precise enough to prevent misunderstanding. William Carter closed his notebook slightly, not out of dismissal, but out of completion, as if the conversation had reached a point where further discussion would only dilute clarity. Across from him, Aaliyah Johnson remained composed, her posture unchanged, but her awareness now fully situated within the structure they had constructed together through careful negotiation. The rooftop restaurant around them continued to glow in muted gold tones, the city of Manhattan stretching endlessly beyond the glass, indifferent yet ever-present. William broke the silence first, his tone now more practical than persuasive. The briefing will be delivered tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, he said. It will include the venue layout, the list of attendees, and the expected sequence of introductions. You will also receive guidance on conversational boundaries, though you retain full discretion over engagement. Aaliyah nodded once, acknowledging without surrendering interpretive independence. And transportation? She asked, her voice steady. William responded immediately. A private vehicle will be arranged. Pickup will be at your requested location within a 30-minute window of your confirmation. She accepted this with a slight incline of her head, then added one final clarification. There will be no public association beyond the event itself. William met her gaze directly. Correct. There will be no public record beyond what is already observable in the room. That answer, while precise, carried the kind of limitation that both of them understood without needing further explanation. It acknowledged that perception in high-visibility environments was never fully contained, only guided. A brief pause followed, during which neither of them spoke. The agreement now existed not as concept, but as structure, complete in its constraints and defined in its temporal boundaries. William finally leaned back slightly, his expression no longer analytical, but neutral in a way that suggested closure. Then everything is in place, he said. Aaliyah did not immediately respond. She looked toward the glass wall once more, where the Manhattan skyline reflected fragmented patterns of light across the polished surface. In that reflection, she saw distance not as escape, but as perspective. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision as before. Then I will treat this as a contained assignment with clearly defined entry and exit points, she said. William gave a single confirming nod. That is accurate. Another silence followed, but it was no longer filled with uncertainty or negotiation. It had become something closer to procedural stillness, the moment after structure is finalized but before action begins. Around them, the restaurant staff continued their quiet movement, unaware that a private agreement had just been completed at one of the highest vantage points in the city. William glanced briefly at the time on his wrist, then returned his attention to Aaliyah. You will receive all materials by morning, he reiterated. If there are any adjustments you require after review, they can be addressed before final confirmation. Aaliyah acknowledged this without hesitation. Understood. William stood slightly, signaling the natural conclusion of the meeting, though not abruptly, maintaining the same controlled composure that had defined his presence throughout. Aaliyah followed a moment later, collecting herself with quiet efficiency, her role within the space returning to its original context as she prepared to leave the table. Before stepping away, she paused briefly, not out of doubt, but out of completion of thought. For clarity, she said, her voice still even, I am not agreeing to become part of a narrative. I am agreeing to participate in a defined interaction with boundaries that remain mine. William looked at her for a moment longer, then responded simply, that distinction is preserved. With that, the agreement between them was no longer in discussion, no longer in formation, but established. And as Aaliyah turned away from the table, the city lights beyond the glass continued their uninterrupted movement, as if unaware that within one quiet corner of Manhattan, a carefully constructed alignment had just been finalized without witness or celebration, only understanding. The elevator doors closed with a soft mechanical hush, separating Aaliyah Johnson from the rooftop restaurant and the carefully constructed agreement she had just finalized with William Carter. She stood alone inside the mirrored elevator for a moment, watching her reflection multiply in every direction, each version of herself calm, composed, and unreadable. The descent toward street level felt slower than expected, not because of time, but because of thought. For the first time since the conversation began, she allowed herself to process not the terms of the arrangement, but the environment it would place her inside. Above her, the city continued its layered rhythm of wealth and motion, but in her mind, the structure of the next day was already forming with quiet precision. Meanwhile, William Carter remained at the rooftop table for several seconds after she had left. He did not immediately call for the bill, nor did he return to his devices or communications. Instead, he sat in silence, his attention briefly fixed on the space she had occupied. In his professional life, he had negotiated acquisitions that reshaped entire markets, yet he recognized that what had just occurred did not belong in the same category as those transactions. This was not leverage in the traditional sense. It was alignment built on boundaries, something more stable and more fragile at the same time. He finally stood, adjusted his cufflinks, and exited the restaurant with the same controlled composure he had arrived with, though something in his focus had shifted toward anticipation rather than control. The following morning arrived with the precision of scheduled systems. At exactly 10 o'clock, Aaliyah received a secure message containing a detailed briefing package. The files were structured, professional, and comprehensive. They outlined the venue in Midtown Manhattan, a private gala hosted in a glass-walled hall overlooking Central Park, where international investors, technology executives, and financial partners would gather under carefully curated lighting and controlled acoustics. The document listed names, roles, and expected conversational dynamics, but more importantly, it included context notes about perception patterns within the room. Aaliyah read each section slowly, not from hesitation, but from discipline. Every detail contributed to a clearer understanding of the environment she would be entering. At precisely 1:45 in the afternoon, a private vehicle arrived at her location as promised. The driver confirmed her name without unnecessary conversation, and the ride toward Manhattan proceeded in quiet order. Through the tinted windows, She observed the gradual transition from residential streets to the dense vertical structure of the city. As the vehicle approached Midtown, the scale of buildings shifted, glass towers reflecting sunlight in fragmented geometry. William Carter arrived at the venue separately, entering through a private access point used exclusively by hosts and primary participants. His presence was immediately recognized by event staff, though his attention remained forward-focused, not outward reactive. Inside the preparation area, he reviewed final details with his advisory team, confirming sequence timing and seating arrangements. The atmosphere was controlled, efficient, and entirely aligned with expectations of a high-level financial gathering. Approximately 20 minutes before the official start, Aaliyah was guided through a discreet entrance reserved for designated participants. She paused briefly inside a preparation corridor where the ambient noise of the main hall could be faintly heard beyond reinforced glass. The sound was not chaotic, but layered, conversations, glassware, and distant music blending into a structured background rhythm. A staff coordinator approached her with professional composure, confirming final positioning details. Aaliyah listened carefully, then adjusted her posture slightly, not as transformation, but as readiness. William arrived moments later at the designated staging area. When he saw her, he offered a subtle nod, acknowledging presence without interruption of focus. For the first time since their agreement, they were not negotiating terms, but preparing execution of those terms within a shared environment. The doors to the main hall opened shortly after, revealing a space designed for visibility and influence. Conversations gradually shifted as guests registered the entrance of William Carter, and then, moments later, Aaliyah, standing beside him. The transition into the room did not create disruption, but it introduced a new reference point within an already structured social system, one that would soon begin to interpret their presence in ways neither of them had directly stated, but both had already accounted for in silence. The main hall of the Midtown Manhattan Gala carried a controlled brilliance, where every reflection of light across the glass walls had been intentionally positioned to amplify presence rather than overwhelm it. Conversations flowed in measured clusters, each group carefully arranged by influence, industry, and anticipated alignment of interests. When William Carter entered with Aaliyah Johnson at his side, the shift in awareness was not immediate in sound, but in attention. It began subtly, with brief pauses in conversation, then gradual reorientation of gaze, as individuals registered not only his arrival, but the configuration of who accompanied him. William maintained his usual composure, posture steady, expression neutral, as he guided Aaliyah through the space with deliberate calm. Aaliyah matched his pace without hesitation, her presence defined not by attempt at adaptation, but by controlled observation. She was aware of the environment, but not absorbed by it. The room itself was filled with individuals accustomed to interpreting value through appearance, association, and proximity to influence. Yet in this moment, the standard pattern of interpretation had been interrupted by the simple fact of presence without explanation. At the central cluster of investors, a brief silence formed as William approached. Greetings were exchanged with professional familiarity, followed by introductions that followed expected structure. However, attention quickly shifted, not because of disruption, but because of curiosity regarding Aaliyah's position within the interaction. William addressed this without unnecessary elaboration, introducing her in a manner consistent with their agreed boundaries, neutral, precise, and without implication beyond the defined context of the evening. Aaliyah responded with equal restraint, acknowledging without expanding, participating without inviting interpretation beyond what was necessary. As the evening progressed, conversations around them resumed, but with subtle recalibration. Questions that would typically focus entirely on financial outlooks or market positioning occasionally drifted toward observation of relational context, though carefully phrased within socially acceptable limits. Aaliyah navigated each exchange with clarity, choosing responses that maintained boundary integrity while remaining professionally composed. William observed this quietly, noting not only her adherence to agreed structure, but the way she maintained internal stability. Within an environment designed to influence perception through subtle pressure rather than direct assertion. At one point during the gathering, a senior investor engaged William in discussion regarding upcoming strategic directions, while simultaneously attempting to interpret Aaliyah's presence through indirect questioning. William responded with controlled brevity, redirecting focus toward relevant topics without allowing unnecessary expansion of assumptions. Aaliyah remained composed throughout, neither withdrawing nor over-engaging, maintaining a steady presence that resisted external redefinition. As the evening reached its midpoint, a scheduled announcement segment began at the front of the hall, drawing collective attention toward a raised platform. The lighting shifted slightly, focusing attention toward the speaker area, while ambient conversations gradually diminished. William and Aaliyah remained positioned within the central viewing zone, their presence now part of the visible composition of the room rather than an isolated interaction. During the announcement, brief acknowledgement was given to attending executives and partners, including William Carter, whose contributions were referenced in formal terms. The mention prompted subtle shifts in attention throughout the room, reinforcing existing perception structures. However, what drew more sustained observation was not William himself, but the consistent presence of Aaliyah beside him, maintained throughout the duration without deviation from the agreed structure of engagement. No additional clarification was offered by either party, consistent with the boundaries previously established. As the program continued, Aaliyah remained observant, noting patterns of interaction within the room, the way influence was distributed through proximity, tone, and timing rather than explicit declaration. William occasionally exchanged brief remarks with her during quieter intervals, each interaction remaining within predefined limits of the arrangement. Toward the later portion of the evening, the atmosphere settled into a more relaxed cadence, with conversations dispersing into smaller groups once again. William and Aaliyah remained present within the space, their participation consistent with the defined temporal structure of the agreement. There was no deviation from established boundaries, only the gradual stabilization of their presence within an environment that had initially reacted with curiosity and had now settled into adapted acceptance. As the final segment of the gathering approached, William acknowledged Aaliyah with a brief nod, signaling the nearing completion of their agreed time frame. She responded with equal subtlety. Neither statement nor gesture extended beyond what had been defined. And as the evening moved toward closure, the structure they had established remained intact, unchanged by external interpretation, defined entirely by the conditions they had set before entering the room, now fully observed in practice